All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started as people are still kind of filtering in back from lunch. Thank you for attending today's session. My name is Jamie Vandermolen-Bowl, and I work closely with Nutrient as well as the folks here on the stage on this project. So you have attended Discovering Dairy's Potential to Build Healthy Soils and Reduce Greenhouse Gases. We know that many companies and others today are looking to farms to adopt climate-smart practices like no-till, cover cropping, and many things we've heard about at this conference to improve soil health and increase water quality. But the question still remains, what is dairy's true potential in this space? This project was founded in 2020. The Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research awarded a $10 million grant to this project, the Dairy Soil and Water Regeneration, as part of the U.S. Dairy Net Zero Initiative, a collaboration of dairy organizations to advance research. Since launching, the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy has partnered with Soil Health Institute to gain a broader understanding of soil health on working dairy farms today across Wisconsin. And then to do a further deep dive to track farms across growing season, to compare kind of business as usual practices compared to some advanced soil health practices we'll talk about today. It's one of the largest research projects focused on this topic, and we're working across 6 major milk-producing states, including Wisconsin, to measure and understand how these differing growing techniques affect the levels of soil health and carbon captured. Now to the speakers and the experts that are on stage today. Our moderator over here to the left is Victor Green. He's the Director of Soil Health and Sustainability at the Dairy Research Institute and is the project lead on the project we'll be sharing. He has worked in the agronomic field and research his entire career, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay region. And then we have Dwayne over here to my right. Many of you may recognize him. He is the co-owner of Deer Run Dairy with his partners Derek Ducat and Dale Bogart, milking around 1,700 cows and farming 2,500 acres in Kewaunee, Wisconsin. Him and his partners have used a no-till for over a decade and achieved their goal of planting 100% cover crops on land used for growing feed. So very impressive, and we're happy to have him here today. And then we have Mara Cloutier, which is the project manager and soil scientist at Soil Health Institute. She plays an important role in this project to facilitate the national scale study and provide scientific support. And at the very end, we have Dennis Bush, who's the research manager at Pioneer Farm. He's been with Pioneer Farm for over 15 years, since 2004, managing research projects that relate to dairy, pasture forage, surface water runoff, and the Feather River, and supervises student researchers as well. I'm sure you recognize him, and it's a familiar face to many of you. I'll now turn it over to Vic, who will share a few minutes more about the project, and then we'll hear from the panelists.
Thank you, Jamie. It's my pleasure to be here in Madison, and I've been involved in this project for about 8 months, I think. So the Dairy Soil Water Regen Project is a nationwide project, as you can see on this map. We've got some projects in Vermont, Cornell, New York with Cornell University. It's pretty well represented in Wisconsin with University of Platteville and University at Madison, Texas A&M, UC Davis, and it's also, we have a plot with USDA ARS in Idaho. The mission at Dairy Research Institute is to help advance and translate scientific research that may help demonstrate dairy as an environmental solution. I think many of you know that dairy, the environmental footprint for feed production is roughly 26%. So we identified a few things that we wanted to do research on specifically. That would be soil carbon sequestration, environmental and agronomic outcomes for new manure-based products, and soil health and water benefits. The project is separated out in 3 different tasks, and task 1 is what Mara and Dwayne are going to be talking quite a bit about today. That was a targeted surveying and benchmarking of soils in the dairy regions, and he did quite a bit of work in Wisconsin. Task 2 is more small plot research and field scale research. And task 3 is the communication with farmers and beyond, and part of that is what we're doing here today. Also, which is a little bit different for research, all these experiments are designed as consistently as possible. All of the samples are collected using the same protocols and analyzed by the same lab. All the gas samples and other field measurements use the same instruments at each location. And the data curation is all done by the Soil Health Institute. So that's a lot of collaboration nationwide with our different research teams. Again, this is task one. Maura's going to talk a little bit further about that. They sampled 87 fields in Wisconsin in the driftless region and the Northeast. Basically the same type of picture. The report hasn't come out, and this is very preliminary, so this is going to be the start of what the farmers are going to get. That's not exactly what they're going to receive, but it's going to be, that's kind of like a version one. Again, a lot of sampling. This was just from 2022. There's thousands of samples. We're using data loggers, Saturos, LICOR units, a lot of very sophisticated instrumentation. So task one, I think there's a good picture there. We're looking at advanced soil health management systems compared to what we're calling business as usual systems, or the traditional approach, which is typically quite a bit of tillage, liquid dairy manure, not using cover crops. So we're doing side-by-side comparisons and small plot comparisons. We have a couple different tasks within the tasks, and 2A, 2B, 2C, etc. 2A is our large plot studies, where we're looking at agronomic performance. Some of the things we're looking at in task 2 are agronomic performance, soil carbon sequestration. I think we can all agree that we need to have better data in that category. We're looking at soil health, environmental outcomes regarding greenhouse gas emissions, and water quality and quantity in the cases of our more arid partners. We're taking a systems-based approach. We're looking at also doing a nitrogen replacement study to see how some of these new manure products mineralize and break down in real-world field conditions. And we also have an aqua ammonia study. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Here's a picture. This was taken by University of Wisconsin at Madison. I just wanted to this is a large plot study, and you can see where on the right there's pretty obviously running out of nitrogen. The middle was soil health management, which is looks good, but not as good as what's on your left there with the business as usual. And this was the first year, and I think there's sometimes there's the temptation to kind of sugarcoat things, but this is real world things that we're looking for. We may talk a little bit later with Dwayne and Maura and Dennis about yield lag and that type of thing. So I just wanted to present that. That's a good picture. We're doing a nitrogen replacement study in 3 locations, one of them in Wisconsin. Again, where we're looking at the breakdown and mineralization of some of our newer manure products, of which there's not very much data. Same with aqua ammonia. Aqua ammonia is a new product where they're using an evaporation engineering process to remove ammonia from the liquid dairy manure, and they're looking at capturing that and selling that in different markets. We did a diffuse band study in Iowa on this, and to help you understand a little bit better, the picture on the right shows different ports or outlets or orifices where we looked at sending aqua ammonia at various depths, 2 inches, 2 and 4, 2, 4, and 6, and I think 2, 4, and 8, and looking to see how much the aqua ammonia was diffused in the slot of the strip till unit. got a lot of really interesting data as far as N2O emissions. The curve at the top is where only all the liquid, the aqua ammonia, was going to the bottom, so it was very concentrated, and it tended to have quite a bit of, significantly higher N2O emissions. The line at the bottom, just briefly, that's just natural emissions from the ground. That's without any liquid. But the next line above that is the one where all of the outlets were used, and the liquid was not concentrated, but it was diluted essentially across all of those outlets. So that's some really promising work there regarding greenhouse gas emissions. Task 3 is our socialization and learning, where we support the development of on-farm economic opportunities and to encourage adaptation of technologies and practices, and to inform and improve the models, which I think we all agree they need to be better. And what to look for in 2023, we're going to convene our modeling group. Again, we've had a meeting already once back in the fall where we had all of our modeling group and teams together, and we intend to do that again in the next few months. We're going to coordinate our publications and research and try to get more of our teams to collaborate across regions and across their research farms. Task 1, and again, Maura can talk about this further, is basically completed in New York and Wisconsin, other than getting out the reports, and we still have to do to soil sample California and Texas. And that's about it, and I will get to our panel. So, Dwayne, you're right next to me. Let me start with you. Can you, how would you define soil health?
Well, soil health to me would be soil with aggregate stability, good water infiltration, something that stands up to a drought tolerance because it's got water holding capacity, just very friable when you take a shovel full of it, breaks apart easily, supports earthworms. If you've got healthy soil, you'll have a lot of earthworms.
That's good. Mark, could you field the same question? As a professional soil scientist?
Well, I'll say, since I'm up here representing the Soil Health Institute, we use the NRCS definition of soil health, right, which is the continued capacity of a soil to function and to sustain plants, animals, and humans. And I think the nice thing about that definition is that it's really just a concept, right? Like, there's no hard and fast right answer to what is soil health, because I think it depends on where you're at and who you're talking to. Like, Dwayne has a definition that makes sense to him, and maybe, other farmers have other definitions that make sense to them in where they're at and what they're farming.
Dennis?
Yeah, I agree. I think one thing that I like to see with regard to, it's kind of a nebulous thing to nail down. That's why nobody really you ask everybody in this room, ask them the same question, and they'll all give you a different answer. It's a combination of chemical, biological, physical structures of the soil, which makes it difficult to get your hands around. But at the same time, it's crucially important. So I think NRCS has some common metrics that they typically use as well to quantify that, like PED stability, infiltration rates, biological activity, so looking at carbon flux from the soils. Another really important indicator that I think is kind of an easy one for everybody to utilize, and I think is a good indicator, is the biological. So one of those measurements is a worm count. So, assuming you like worms and you're not afraid to touch a worm, you take 1 cubic foot of soil and just go through and sift through it. It's rather laborious and time consuming, but it gives you a good kind of idea of, I think, overall what it's kind of an indicator organism. It gives you an idea of what the soil health is. And we, I think we see that those numbers do correspond to the data we see in the water quality. So when we're looking at rainfall simulations, and we're looking at how much water is infiltrating versus running off, what our soil losses are. If you look at the extremes on that, where we might have the majority of the rainfall running off, typically those soils, you're going to have low earthworm counts, 3, 4, 5 per cubic foot. You contrast to those soils that are going to have very high infiltration rates, where you have 70, 80, 90% of the water, the rainfall that applies, infiltrates, you're going to see 20, 30, 40, 50 worms per cubic foot. So I think that's the biological component's one that's pretty easy. That specific one is somewhat easy to kind of implement and evaluate, and it's interesting that it relates to the other data.
Thank you. So Maura, we talked a little bit about task one. Could you tell us why Soil Health Institute picked Dwayne as one of the farmers to do a soil survey on?
Well, the short answer is because Jen Block told me to.
Okay.
Maybe the more appropriate answer would be, we had this iterative process where we knew we wanted to go and sample a lot of commercial dairies in the regions where we're doing our on-farm research trials. And so through, processes where, where are the dairies, right? Where are they in Wisconsin? Well, they're kind of everywhere here, so we didn't have to really figure out exactly where we wanted to sample based on dairies. But then we had to look at, okay, well, what are the soil types like? What's the geography? What is it that we're really going to be getting if we go into a certain area and start asking dairy farmers if we can come sample? And while we only expected or planned to sample one specific region in Wisconsin, we actually ended up sampling 2. So we have quite a bit of farmers in fields that we sampled in Wisconsin compared to New York and Idaho. But once we decided on a region, then it's like, okay, well, how can we get connected to those farmers? Because this is really the first project that SHI has been involved with that relates to dairy. And so we didn't know dairy farmers. So then I talked to Jen Block and we're like, okay, well, what are the farmer-led watershed groups in the area that might be interested in having us come sample? What are the co-ops around? So we talked to PDPW, we talked to Discovery Farms, we talked to Peninsula Pride, right? And that's where we got Dwayne and others. So it was really this iterative process to find the dairy farmers, but it also served a goal of the task 3 objectives, which is sharing learnings, because a large part of that is going to be us kind of going back to these farmer-led watershed groups and co-ops and other organizations and asking them to help spread the word, right? Help us share the results, because SHI and DMI, our ability to engage with more farmers is going to be limited based on everyone else's, maybe their excitement about the project, right? If we can get PDPW excited about the results, then they're going to go tell their farmers what we found. And the same with Discovery Farms and Peninsula Pride. So I think, just engaging with the dairy industry is what led Dwayne to be a part of the project.
Thank you. Dwayne, how did you get into reduced tillage and no-till and planting cover crops? What pushed you into that, or what made you decide to start doing that?
Well, before I built a larger dairy, or we went that route, I was doing no-till because I had extra acres and I sold the crops off of it so I could do a corn bean rotation. And so I did no-till many years ago. Then when we built the dairy, I kind of got away from no-till somewhat because of the requirements of incorporating manure. So we gradually got away from incorporating manure and just surface applying it on our hay ground, and the practice of no-till allowed us to increase the rates that we were able to apply the manure. So that kind of led us down the path of no-till, and from there we went into more cover crops and planting green, into the cover crops, and we were getting good results with that, so we continued down that path.
Thank you. Dennis, could you describe the University of Wisconsin Platteville Pioneer Farm a little bit? Tell us about some of the research that you're doing there.
Sure. So Pioneer Farm is part of the University of Wisconsin Platteville. So it's not located on really or near campus. But if you take Highway 151 from Madison towards Dubuque, you go past Belmont. Before you get to Platteville, we're on the south side of the road, about 2 miles from there. Originally, it was purchased and utilized as an educational lab for students. Then if you go back to, I think it was 2001, Tommy Thompson was governor at that time, and they initiated a program called the Wisconsin Agricultural Stewardship Initiative. Anybody remember that program? A few people. So with that program, they started funding research at Pioneer Farm. They started more aggressively funding the Discovery Farms program, which is in University of Wisconsin Extension Service, and then there was also funding allocated UW-Madison for component research. And our role within that, the initiative was to do farmer-driven, field-scale applied research, which really kind of ended up being a primary focus on edge-of-field surface water runoff. So primarily from the initial research that was done, it was monitoring runoff, edge of field, pretty much very similar to the Discovery Farms program, where we're looking at measuring the volume and collecting samples of that runoff so we can determine soil loss and nutrient loss primarily. Now we've done a few projects that are short-lived one-offs where we also look at hormones or pathogens, things like that. But primarily it's been looking at soil loss, nutrient loss. Since that initial investment in the edge of field, we've worked with UW-Stevens Point, and we've added a pretty significant infrastructure for looking at groundwater, so we can measure and kind of monitor what we see in our groundwater beneath Pioneer Farm. And that's been fairly active, especially recently with kind of the concerns with karst topography in southwest Wisconsin. We also have instrumentation so we can look at what water is flowing through the soil profile and kind of capture that at about a 1 meter depth. Those are called the undisturbed soil core lysimeters. So we get an understanding too of what's vertically flowing through the soil profile. In addition, we've looked at more recently with Andrew Cartmel coming on. He's been doing more work on soil carbon, soil health, greenhouse gas emissions. So all those things that kind of roll into this project that we're working on right now, the soil water health, or dairy soil water regenerative project. Keep changing the abbreviation on me. So that's what we're currently active on. We also have done kind of to support the edge of field and get a little more information on water quality locally. We've worked with producers in the LASA group, Lafayette Ag Stewardship Alliance, and the kind of forming Grant County Watershed Pride program, which Andy Buttles is kind of leading that effort, and done some work on some of those producer farms where we look at generating a rain event using a rainfall simulator and looking at, again, how much of that rainfall that we apply is going into the soil versus running off. And when it runs off, how much soil is lost, what kind of phosphorus loads are we seeing for total phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus. So that's pretty much in a nutshell. I do have some additional visual aids if you want me to kind of go through that, show some of the data we've collected.
Why don't you do that?
Sure. Get up out of my chair. So I mentioned the rainfall simulation. So what we do basically is we set up what looks like kind of a shower stall out in the field. All right, so we elevate a very specific sprayer nozzle at a height of 10 feet, and we run that at 5 psi. And then it's raining down onto a plot. The plot is 1 meter by 2 meters. All right, and we do this 2 days in a row. So the first day we go out and we do the rain. As soon as it starts to run off into the plot, we start our timer, and we run it for 30 minutes. Okay, so then we don't collect any data on day one typically, but then day two we'll come back and do the same thing. just to get an idea. Then we'll collect the data, we'll look at how much is running off versus how much is infiltrating, and collect samples and look at what the nutrient and soil content is of the samples. So the data I'm going to go through right now are these are not data, just visual. You can kind of see what the result is instead of numbers. See a lot of numbers of today. So this first one is a sample, actual sample from that event, from that simulated event we collected on Pioneer Farm actually. Pretty intensive tillage at this site. Okay, we had the year prior was corn silage, and then manure injected with a pretty aggressive toolbar, followed by 2 turns of tillage and then planting, rainfall simulation being conducted not too long after planting before canopy. Okay, so you can see a fair amount of turbidity in that sample. Now we compare that to our neighbor down the road. This is from Darlington Ridge, where they were using pretty much conventional tillage, but with cover crops. Again, this is the same time of the year, within a week of the same event we did at our farm at Platteville. Less turbidity. Same neighborhood in that Wyota area. Mike Burgett, who works also a lot with Cottonwood Dairy, he's a strip till farmer. Manure applications and also cover crops. See a little less turbidity in those samples. And then going a little bit south of the border into some producers we work with in Joe Davies County. This is long-term no-till with cover crop. Again, that's a sample of the runoff from that event. And you can see definite difference in the turbidity of these samples.
No manure?
This one would have had manure as well. So all of these are, they're all manured systems. Yep. And I think in this case it was a broadcast beef bed pack. In this case, the last one is corn grain that was interseeded into clover. So kind of like a living mulch system, right? So a permanent grass cover in the whole plot. So you can see the visual differences between these samples. Also, the other important thing is the infiltration rates. So we'll look at, basically on this end, 2/3 runoff. 2/3 of the total applied as runoff. On the other end of the spectrum, the opposite, 2/3 infiltration. And that's pretty typical on soils with high, good soil health. Usually it's 70, 80, 90% infiltration rates. As far as soil loss, you see about a 10-fold difference from one end to the other. Over here we're about 1,000 pounds per acre equivalent. To the other end, these two, they're around around 100 pounds or less per acre for that one rain event. Phosphorus, in this event we're looking about an equivalent of 1 pound phosphorus per acre loss versus a 1/10 pound or less on those. So a big difference that we're seeing. Again, this is the interaction between cover crops, tillage, manure management that we're seeing on these sites.
So after the presentation, you can come up here and look at that if you want. So thank you, Dennis.
Yep.
Dwayne, you are part of the Door Kiwani Demo Farm Network. Could you talk a little bit about that group and what your role is in that?
As a member of Peninsula Pride Farms, we were approached and asked if we wanted to be part of the Demo Farms Network, and I had 4 farms agree to become part of that network, and we try different things and work with the NRCS on that, and we demonstrate different practices and the results that we see from them, anywhere from putting manure in between rows of corn with a tanker system to just planting green. We try different things and invite people out to see what's happening.
Do you think that peer group has helped you speed up your learning curve or the process of getting these systems, these complex biological systems to work?
And anytime you put a group of heads together, you're better
Yeah.
with other opinions than just your own, and we learn from each other's winnings and losings.
Right.
So yeah, I think we're successful at speeding up the process by having these groups. It's nice when you've got somebody from the NRCS working on your team to help also, and he leads us in the right direction, tells us what hasn't worked somewhere else so we don't make the same mistake. So yeah, it's a good process.
So we had lunch earlier together, and one of the things you talked about was that you had attended the No-Till conference recently, and one of the things we talked about was what a positive group that was. I would imagine that this peer group that you're part of is a pretty positive group also.
Yes, there's a lot of innovators in the group, and we try, and we have, in the summer months, we have monthly conservation conversations to show our practices, what we're doing differently in the field, what's working, what's not working. So it is a positive group.
Okay, thank you. Maura, could you tell us a little bit about some of the instrumentation that you're using for greenhouse gas sampling? I guess where I wanted to go with that, I feel like a lot in this project, we are field testing products and analysis equipment for companies because a lot of this stuff is very new. So that's kind of where I'm heading with that.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. A lot of the instrumentation that we're using, maybe it's been around for a little while, but it maybe hasn't seen as much use as we've been giving it. I don't know, how many samples do we have for greenhouse gas emissions so far? I have it by the numbers.
It's over 1,000.
Over 7,000. That was as of October of last year. So.
And we have 3 to 4 years to go. So
I know. So it's a lot. And no, I think one thing that I don't know that we really realized that we would be doing is helping these companies kind of improve their instrumentation and also the back-end data processing. Like we've been working with a group, so the greenhouse gas instruments are Lycor units, and we've worked a lot with the people at Lycor just on improving their data processing, because the setup that they had was really clunky and not very user-friendly. But if you can imagine taking thousands of samples, you really need something that's going to be efficient. So that way, Andrew with Dennis isn't spending half his life processing greenhouse gas data, because there's a lot of other things that we're doing too, right? Like that we have Saturo measurements that we're taking, and the instrumentation is a Saturo, and the measurement is basically water infiltration, right? It's saturated hydraulic conductivity. And those measurements are incredibly important for soil health because it tells you how quickly water will infiltrate your soil. And that is, like Dwayne, we already heard Dwayne say that that's something that he thinks is a key component to soil health. And so I think that there is a larger component to what we're doing in as far as advancing technologies that I probably hadn't really thought about until right now. So thank you, Victor.
thank you, Maura. One of the things I should say, and again, a lot of this stuff is very new. The equipment's new. Even the manure, these new manure products, you would think this would be easy to spread, and it's not. And we've had to overcome a lot of challenges even in that regard. And also want to emphasize that this research we're doing, this is all-encompassing research, but I don't want to over make any exceptional promises. I think we hope to contribute to science, but we're not going to be the final answer. Unfortunately, science doesn't work like that. You'll never hear the phrase, the speed of science, come out of my mouth. It's usually a very slow process, so I want to emphasize that. How will this research be used in the future? What type of research what type of follow-up do you think we should be doing? I'll just throw that out at Dennis. What kind of, we've got a lot of different things going on in this project. What other things should we have put in there, or would you want to do in the future?
Well, right now, I think there's a lot on our plates right now that we're looking at. So I have to keep doing this, checking myself to not overcommit, which is so easy to do because it's pretty exciting. There's a lot of options, a lot of things, that we could tweak and evaluate. Just like, I think before about, the interaction between management and cover crops, manure management, how much variability is in each one of those components. Cover crops, I kind of catch myself saying this all the time, but I don't agree with myself. It's not necessarily cover crops and not cover crops, right? That's really coarse. It's what cover crops are you using? What rate are you putting them in? When are you applying? How are you establishing those cover crops? When are you terminating them? Are you putting manure, injecting it? Are you applying it to the surface within those? I mean, it just becomes almost too much to get your head around. So I think there's just infinite, it seems to me, infinite variation. And then on top of that, the farmers are constantly changing their management practices. So I don't think there's, like you said, there's never going to be an end to this work. For us, one thing that I would, specifically think about is utilizing the rainfall simulation technology to be able to evaluate some of the different timing and rate issues along with the Cedron solids to see how that affects water quality, because that's something we can do much quicker than within the context of an edge of field paired basin study, more at the plot scale. But I think that there's just a lot of opportunity, and I think this project as laid out will be excellent, but it's just going to be the beginning of the work that would need to be done.
So Dwayne, kind of an open-ended question. Again, I'm not from Wisconsin. I'm always told lots of excuses and reasons why people can't get cover crops in, they can't do this, they can't do that, yet you're able to do it. How come you're able to do it and others can't? Are you that good, or?
No matter how late it's getting, if we can get that rye to germinate, and you might not see very much of it in the fall or the early winter, but it's there, and you can multiply what's on top by double that for what's underneath the ground as far as root growth. And for sure in the spring, it's going to take off, and you're going to get growth out of that cover, which it's protecting the ground at a critical time there too. Just at the No-Till conference, there was a discussion on the energy that's harvested from the sun to put back into the soil. It's 25% of that is on either side of the normal growing season. So you're not taking advantage of the energy that is put into it by that cover crop into the soil life. So we just do it. The ground would have to be froze before we didn't establish that cover. And we do toy with the idea of maybe going to a shorter day corn silage, but we've backed off from maybe 105 to 100 day corn now, and we're still having success with that. And then we will, if the earlier established covers, we'll apply surface apply manure in the fall. If we don't get it on in the fall, we'll do it in the early spring when it's fit. We won't apply if we're going to be disturbing or destroying, making tracks in that field, putting the manure on. Because we do have smooth fields. My guys get really mad if the fields are rough. They don't like that. We got to go 100 miles an hour chopping corn, and hay, so we got to keep our fields in good condition. So we also, after wheat, we'll put in a multi-species, and in the spring, that's generally when we will establish our hay crop, and we no-till into that cover after it's terminated there. And we've had very good luck with doing that, to the point where Barry was just, Barry Buboltz from the NRCS was very surprised by the success we have with doing that. And then when we terminate our alfalfa to go to corn, we'll do that after fourth crop and plant our multi-species cover into that also early on, and we've had good luck with that.
Thank you. I'd like to ask all of our panelists the question, do you feel dairy can be part of an environmental solution? Dennis, why don't you go first?
Certainly, I think before working at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, the Pioneer Farm, I was at the University of Minnesota in the Extension Service. I worked as a manure management extension educator. So that's all I worked on. From the Twin Cities south, so about half the state, with a lot of dairy, a lot of hogs, poultry in that area. I remember Giles Randall, one of the scientists located at Waseca Southern Research and Outreach Center, did a study where he would utilize manure in the field, doing a rate response trial, and compare that to equal amounts of commercial fertilizer being applied. And without fail, I think the manure outproduced the commercial fertilizer, usually a 15% increase. So I remember his publication on that, the extension publication was Manure, Gunk, or Gold. I think was the name of the publication. But always seeing that positive benefit, that's in the yield component. And I also think the same would be true on the soil health component, that it really spurs a lot of supports biological activity. And it's great soil amendment, as far as that goes.
Mark, can dairy be an environmental solution?
Well, I think in some cases, we're already seeing people do that, like what we're seeing with Dwayne's farm. And then I think it has to be too, right? And just naturally, it has to be part of the solution. I love ranch dressing, and I love cheesy charcuterie boards, so I want to see dairy throughout my life, right? I don't want it to go anywhere. And there's this product, right, manure, we keep coming back to manure. It causes issues, we know that. But it is an organic product that has carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. It has a lot of microbes in it, right? So adding that to soil, naturally you would think is good for the soil. I worked at 2 different experiments at Penn State during my PhD. One of them was a long-term tillage experiment that had only ever received synthetic fertilizer for the past 41 years. And then another project that was called the Sustainable Dairy Cropping Systems Project, where every plot received manure every year unless it was alfalfa. And you could just see that the soil that was under manure had so much biological activity, right? Dennis had mentioned earthworms earlier. They were everywhere, and insects, ants, spiders, which is a little creepy when they're crawling on you, after you take a soil sample, but it's still great to see that. And in contrast, when you dig into that soil that had only ever received synthetic fertilizer, there's just nothing there. Right? You might see an earthworm here or there, but they're sparse and they're not there. And I think that kind of really, in my mind, made a dichotomy, right? Like, just naturally having my hand in those different soils, I was like, manure is great. It is. It's just a matter of the right placement, the right timing, and getting those things right. But manure definitely has a place, and dairy farming has a place as part of the solution to our environmental problems.
Thank you. Dwayne, you're living it,
I can't top that.
Yeah, no, that was pretty good, but you're a living proof of it, actually, with your work, your practical work. So with that, I think we could take a few questions if there are any. But before we do, I wanted to make sure I single out Greg Sanford, who's with the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And I want to say that my whole career has been in agricultural research. I've been on lots of research farms, and I want to really tip my hat to the state of Wisconsin, working with Platteville and Madison, your research farms. They're top notch, and I really have a lot of respect for them. So are there any questions out there in the audience? Go ahead, sir.
You mentioned that there's some difficulties with spreading newer manure products out there. Can you
Yes.
speak to some of the details of those problems?
Okay, the question was new manure products and difficulties in spreading it. The problem that we've had, I'm talking about a company called Cedron. We call it Cedron Solids. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with or not. They're improving the product pretty quickly, but what we have to work at the research level is what they've got now in their prototype, with their prototype equipment. It's very wet. It's not a uniform product. You couldn't use a spinner spreader, or you would have difficulty. You have to almost use like an old-fashioned flail manure spreader to get rid of it. So mostly the product on the research level is that it's not a consistent and uniform product. I think they're going to have that solved probably within a year or so. It's my understanding. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Dwayne, as a demo farm, I know you get a lot of questions, particularly about soil health. What's the most common question you get? And then on the flip side, what do you wish they would ask?
I'll repeat that. So Dwayne, what's the most common question you get?
The most common question I would get would be, how does it work when we're going into planting green? How does the closing system work? The timing, how to determine when you terminate the crop, if you terminate it before or after, do you roll the crop down? Those kinds of questions are pretty common. And the second part was?
What
do you
was the
wish they'd
second part?
ask?
I'm sorry.
Oh, I guess I wish they would ask, why should we do this? Because
Good
I
question.
think it's you can come up with a plethora of reasons for doing the practices that we do, no-till and cover crops, and get into a good discussion as to what it does for soil health and water infiltration and all the positives that come out of it. Yes, there's some negatives. It's a learning curve, there's no doubt. It comes with some headaches, but in the long run, I think it's the path to the future.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, I think that concludes our presentation, and I want to thank all our panelists. If you want to come up here and look at Dennis's little demonstration here, that'd be fine. So,
Oh, no. Too much work.
do any of our panelists have any final words you'd like to say or add?
If anybody has any questions about what problems we run into, or, feel free to give us a call or talk to me or whatever, because there's issues, but we work through several of them.
And maybe perhaps one thing too, I don't want to oversell like cover crops, because there are also issues you have to be concerned about. Like, for example, I think it was 2018. We had an excellent spring in southwest Wisconsin, so warm and so wet, and we had rye planted as a cover. And we got a little greedy, and we thought, well, we're going to harvest that and use it as a feed source, and then we'll come back in and establish corn for silage or grain after that, which we did, and then it quit raining. And we didn't get hardly any rain the rest of that year, so the corn yield was diminished because of the amount of, because we didn't really just produce a great forage, but we used a lot of water at the same time. And the same thing we saw working with Andy Buttles 2 years ago. He's in Grant County by Lancaster. Just on a small area, he was trying green planting, and it works. Planting green from a water, hydrologic and runoff standpoint works very well. We did rainfall simulations there, and typically I said, we would have runoff that would start within usually 5, 10, 15 minutes on a plot. We rained on those plots for over an hour before they started to run off, because there's just so much capacity for storage when you have a lot of biomass above ground, which he did, he terminated. But then, again, a dry fall. Andy thought that maybe that was a 20 bushel differential in was just a small area, but he noticed it in those areas. I don't know, have you seen that on your farm? If you wait to terminate too late and that crop is transpired too much water out of the profile?
Well, we really use the rye as a water management tool. What we did learn is that if you're going to terminate ahead of planting, you better make sure that you plant. Because if you get rain after you terminate, now you've got a sponge that doesn't want to dry out. So we generally, if we're not positive that we're going to be able to spray that field timely or plant it within a certain period of time, we will wait and terminate after. And then the other thing is, if you do get the rain and the field is not terminated, you're going to get in that field a lot sooner to start planting again, because the rye is going to take up the moisture that was there, the excess. This summer, Barry was out taking soil temperatures, and it was a hot day, and the soil temperature where the rye had drowned out from the previous fall, the soil temperature was 100 degrees, and underneath the rye that was rolled down and covered, that ground was at 87 degrees and moist. So it does conserve moisture that way.
I think we can see a lot of value to this peer-to-peer network that you guys are using. A lot of good information there.
We don't harvest our cover crop. We leave it there. We haven't harvested it.
Any further questions? Yes.
Dwayne, you say you're killing off your alfalfa or not? Are you
Yeah.
killing it off in the fall, and why? Why wouldn't you let that grow through the spring, and then in the spring kill off, or what? Do you feel you lose too much, or too much of a chance of too much grow back if you don't kill it off in the fall?
We're just trying to get some diversity in the soil with the multi-species covers. So we take it out in the fall, and then we grow a pretty potent biomass crop with that, and then we just no-till into that in the spring. We did try and interseed or put a cover into alfalfa that was living. We didn't terminate it, and the alfalfa was too aggressive. The covers didn't come through. I mean, they were there a little, but not like you want. So we're just basically doing it to try and improve the soil health and take advantage of a little extra growing season.
And we also need to ask Dwayne about the soil health samples that we took from his farm this year. I was out there in, June, sweating, getting all dirty, taking samples on your farm, and I gave you some results. So what did you think about them?
The field that's been in no-till for about 10 years, that's kind of a gravel pit type soil. It grows well, but the organic matter in that was higher than anything else that we sampled. It was like a 4%, somewhere in there. I believe that's what the number said, and it's unbelievable that ground would have that high of organic matter.
Maybe you could explain a little bit more about Task 1, Maura, about how eventually Dennis will get a report where he can benchmark his soils with other regional soils in his area, and even nationwide, I guess. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So we went out and did this big sampling campaign in 2022. We're going to go out and sample California and Texas this year, and maybe adding a few more states, in the next coming years too. And we're doing an analysis like aggregate stability, soil organic carbon, potential carbon mineralization. So that's like a biological activity assay. And then plant available water. Those are the 4 main measurements that we're taking from each of the soil samples. And once we get the data back from the lab and we've had time to QA/QC it and look over it and make sure it seems like everything is good, then we're going to send out reports to the farmers that we sampled giving them their individual results, and then also sharing the aggregated means or averages for the regions that they're in. And just so that they have an idea of, okay, well, this is where I am, and this is where other dairy farmers in the region are. Trying to categorize them into groupings based on management systems, it seemed really easy in the beginning, but now that we're starting to look at, you know, the management data that we collected from Dwayne and our other farmers, it's actually really complicated because, you know, we want to group systems based on, say, no-till and those that till and the grazers that we sampled. But you start to look at the people who are tilling and you're like, well, you know, some of these farmers are only tilling the top 2 inches of their soil, and then some of them are tilling 6 inches, 8 inches deep. And so, you know, I think we need to start thinking about how do we best represent what's going on commercial dairy farms and really just kind of commercial farms in general when we start thinking about soil health, because so much of the conversation has been driven by what's happening on university research farms where it's prescribed, right? Like year 1 of this 6-year rotation is always going to be X, Y, and Z. And we know that that's just not the case on working dairy farms or any farm, right? They're all complicated. You have weather to contend with. You have the price of corn, right? If the corn prices are really high, you might tear up some of your alfalfa fields and plant more corn that year. And that's just not something that you would do on a university farm. So there's a lot of diversity that we need to incorporate in our analyses, but that's coming. Stay tuned.
Last question, Maura. How does the soil sample that you took for Dennis, how does that differ from a soil sample, say a crop consultant would take on a farm? It's much more time intensive, et cetera.
Probably. I guess probably the biggest difference is that we use the same protocol on Dwayne's farm when we took our soil samples as how we took our soil samples in New York and how we'll take our soil samples in California. And we're using the same lab, following the same standard operating procedure for those measurements. And I think that is really unique about this project because we're developing this database and this benchmark for soil health on dairy farms.
All right, thank you. Is there any other questions? Be glad to.
I'm wondering on seed depth, you know, when you go into green versus going into something that's killed off, is it very informing? Too deep? I mean, can you go 3 inches? It seems like when you go into green, you want to get below that root system, and it seems like it's pretty deep.
Well, that's kind of funny because I watch the guys plant and I'm going, oh man, they're going pretty deep. But that's what we're finding is, you know, we're 2.5 inches deep when we're planting, which when I was a kid, it was like 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches is where you wanted to be. We're deeper now. So, but one of the hardest things with planting green is watching your neighbor's conventional corn come up and you can row it and it looks beautiful, and yours, you can't see it. It's like, when's it gonna come? And then when it comes through, it's kind of spindly and it looks kind of sick, but it'll catch up. And that is a problem, is how to roll that crop down and keep it down so that you can get light to corn faster, to the plant, because it wants to come back up. Unless it gets this tall and then you're, you know, looking at the middle of June or whatever to roll it down, then it might stay down.
So just to end, hopefully in a couple years, maybe we could be back here and presenting some more results. The project's really just getting going, and we're just beginning to start getting some results, but it's a 5 to 6 year project, so it's just at the beginning stages right now. So hopefully in a few years we'll have something a little more definite for you. So with that, I'd like to give a round of applause to our panelists.
Good job, Dwayne.
Thank you.